I got my own brother kicked out of the family for something he didn't do, and I'd do it again. The phone woke me at 6 a.m., and I knew something was wrong before I even answered. My mother Aitana's name lit up the screen, and when I picked up, her voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand her. "Someone stole the retirement fund," she said. "Every penny your father and I saved. Gone." I sat up in bed trying to make sense of what she was telling me. 30 years of savings, their whole future, just disappeared. "Mom, slow down," I said. "What do you mean stolen?" But she was already crying too hard to explain anything else, so I told her I was on my way and threw on whatever clothes I could find. The drive to my parents' house took about 20 minutes, and I spent every one of them trying to figure out how something like this could even happen. They weren't careless people. They had passwords and security questions and all the things you're supposed to have. When I pulled into their driveway, I counted 6 other cars already parked along the street. The whole family had beaten me there. I walked through the front door, and the living room felt like a courtroom where the trial was already over. My brother Chadwick sat in the corner with his head down, not looking at anyone. He seemed smaller somehow, like he was trying to disappear into the couch cushions. My uncle Dominic paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, his face red and his hands moving while he talked. He was always the loudest person in any room, but today, he seemed especially worked up. My mother sat next to my father on the love seat, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that was already falling apart. Everyone else stood around like they were waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. "It had to be someone with access to the account," Dominic said, stopping his pacing to point at no one in particular. "And we all know Chadwick's been struggling with money." The room got quiet in that way where everyone's thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to say it out loud. I looked at my brother, and he finally lifted his head. His eyes met mine, and I could see how scared he was. Chadwick had made some bad choices in his 20s, got into some debt, had to borrow money from our parents more than once. But that was years ago. He'd been doing better since then. He had a steady job now and his own apartment. The idea that he would steal from our parents felt wrong to me in a way I couldn't explain yet. Chadwick looked up at me with desperate eyes. "I didn't take anything," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "You have to believe me." Nobody responded. My mother wouldn't even look at him. My father stared at the floor like it might have answers. Dominic crossed his arms and shook his head like he'd already made up his mind about everything. The silence in that room was heavier than anything I'd felt in a long time. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, because someone needed to start asking real questions instead of just throwing blame around. "Everything," my mother said quietly. "The retirement account, the savings, even the emergency fund. Over $200,000, Harry. All of it moved out over the past 3 months. 3 months. That meant someone had been doing this slowly, carefully. Someone who knew how to avoid getting caught too fast. That didn't sound like my brother at all. Chadwick was a lot of things, but patient wasn't one of them. If he was desperate enough to steal from our parents, he would have grabbed everything at once and dealt with the problems later. This felt different. This felt planned by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app. I'd been added to the family accounts years ago as a backup in case something happened to my parents. At the time, it seemed like just a smart thing to do. Now I was grateful for it because it meant I could see exactly what happened without waiting for someone to show me. I scrolled through the transfer records, looking at each one carefully. The amounts were different every time, ranging from a few $100s to several thousand, but they all came from the same place. The device ID was listed right there in the security log, and I recognized it right away, because I'd helped set it up myself. "The transfers all came from the family computer," I said out loud. Everyone in the room turned to look at me, the one in Dominic's office at the family business. For just a second, something changed in my uncle's face. A small flicker behind his eyes before he got control of himself again. "That computer's been there for 10 years, he said quickly. "Anyone in the family could have used it." I kept looking at the records on my phone, at the device ID that tied everything back to that office. The office that Dominic kept locked. The computer that sat 10 feet from his desk. The same computer that my uncle used every single day to run the family business. I didn't say anything else right then, but I made a mental note of how fast he was to point fingers at my brother, and how hard he was working to make sure nobody looked anywhere else. The moment I mentioned Dominic's office, he shut me down fast. "You're just protecting your little brother like you always do," he said, and his voice had that reasonable tone that made me sound crazy for even suggesting anything. "You can't see the truth because you're too close to it." I looked around the room for someone to back me up, but my own mother was nodding along with him like everything he said made perfect sense. So I kept my mouth shut for the moment, but I started digging. Dominic had been the one pushing hardest to blame Chadwick from the very start. That felt wrong to me. I made copies of everything I could find on my phone before anyone thought to delete the evidence. The next family meeting was scheduled for 4 days from now. I planned to be ready. The next 4 days felt like the longest of my life, and I spent most of them on the phone trying to get someone in my family to listen to me. I started with my aunt on my mother's side, thinking maybe someone outside of Dominic's direct influence would be willing to hear what I had to say. But the second I brought up the computer in his office, she cut me off. "Dominic already explained everything," she said with this tired sigh like I was a child who couldn't accept the obvious. "Why are you still defending Chadwick?" I tried to explain about the device ID and how the transfers were all linked to that one computer, but she wasn't interested. She told me that Dominic had called her the day before and walked her through the whole situation. According to him, Chadwick had been using the office computer whenever he visited the business, which wasn't even true because Chadwick hadn't set foot in that building in over a year. But my aunt believed it, because Dominic said it. And that was apparently enough for her. I called 3 more relatives that day and got the same response every single time. My uncle on my father's side said he felt bad for me because I was clearly struggling to accept the truth about my own brother. My cousin, who lived 2 towns over, told me that Dominic had already warned her I might call and that I would probably try to make up stories to protect Chadwick. The word warned stuck with me because it meant Dominic wasn't just defending himself. He was actively working to shut me down before I could even open my mouth. Every conversation ended the same way, with someone telling me to let it go and stop making things worse for the family. By the end of the second day, I felt like I was screaming into a wall that kept getting thicker. The family meeting was still 2 days away, and Dominic had already won the argument without me even being in the room. I drove to my parents' house on the 3rd day because I needed to see my mother face to face. Maybe if I could sit down with her and show her what I found, she would at least consider that something wasn't right. But when I got there, the house was full of people again. Dominic was holding court in the kitchen, talking to a group of relatives about how sorry he felt for my parents and how hard this whole situation had been on everyone. I stood in the doorway watching him play the concerned family member, and it made my stomach turn. That's when my cousin Vicente appeared at my side. He was younger than me by a few years, quiet most of the time, and usually stayed out of family drama. But he grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward the back hallway where nobody else could hear us. "I believe you're onto something," he whispered, and his eyes kept darting toward the kitchen like he was scared someone might catch us talking. "But Dominic's been telling everyone you're in denial. He says you can't accept that Chadwick did this because you two have always been close." I felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time in days. At least one person in this family could see through the act. "Vicente, the transfers all came from his computer, the one in his locked office." "How is nobody asking questions about that?" Vicente shook his head slowly. "Because he has an answer for everything. He told people that Chadwick used to come by the office sometimes and that he must have done it when nobody was watching. And everyone believes him because he's Dominic. He's been running the family business for 20 years. People trust him." I wanted to punch a wall. Dominic had spent decades building up his reputation as the reliable one, the responsible one, the guy who always had the family's best interests at heart. And now he was using all that trust to destroy my brother's life. Vicente squeezed my arm and looked me in the eyes. "Be careful, Harry. I don't know what's really going on here, but Dominic is 3 steps ahead of you. Whatever you're planning, make sure you have proof that can't be denied." Then he walked away and rejoined the group in the kitchen like we'd never spoken at all. I stayed in that hallway for a minute trying to figure out my next move. Vicente was right about one thing. I needed better proof. The device ID alone wasn't enough because Dominic had already created a story to explain it away. I needed something that couldn't be twisted or denied. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and went through the bank records again, line by line, looking for anything I might have missed the first time. I pulled up the timestamps on each transfer and compared them to what I remembered about Chadwick's schedule. My brother worked a regular job with set hours, and I knew for a fact that he'd been at work during some of the times the transfers supposedly happened. But when I looked closer at the records, something seemed off. The timestamps had been changed. I could see it in the metadata, in the small details that most people wouldn't know to look for. Someone had gone into the records and altered the times to make it look like the transfers happened when Chadwick was at our parents' house for dinner or visiting on a weekend. The original times were different. The original times were during business hours, when Chadwick would have been at his job across town. Someone had deliberately made my brother look guilty by changing the evidence after the fact. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't just about stealing money anymore. This was about framing someone for a crime they didn't commit. And the only person who had access to those records, the only person who could have made those changes, was the same person who controlled the family business and that locked office. Dominic wasn't just a thief. He was setting up my brother to take the fall for everything. The next morning, I drove back to my parents' house with my laptop. I had screenshots of everything, the original timestamps and the altered ones, laid out side by side so anyone could see the difference. I found my mother Aitana in the kitchen making coffee, and she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since my grandfather passed away. The stress of the past week was wearing her down, and part of me felt bad for adding to her burden. But I couldn't let Chadwick go down for something he didn't do. "Mom, I need to show you something," I said, setting the laptop on the counter. "Just give me 5 minutes, please." She turned to look at me, and her expression was already closed off. "Harry, I don't want to do this again. I know, but this is important. Someone changed the records to make Chadwick look guilty. The timestamps were altered after the transfers happened. I can prove it." I started to turn the laptop toward her, but she held up her hand before I could even open the file. "Dominic already told us you'd try this," she said, and her voice was so sad it almost broke me. "He said you'd fabricate evidence to protect your brother. He said you wouldn't be able to help yourself because you've always taken care of Chadwick, even when he didn't deserve it." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My own mother was looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the one hurting the family by refusing to accept the obvious truth. "Mom, I didn't fabricate anything. These are real records. The metadata doesn't lie." She shook her head and turned back to her coffee. "I can't do this, Harry. I can't keep going back and forth while your father and I are trying to figure out how to survive without our retirement. Dominic has been helping us through this. He's been there for us. And all you've done is make accusations and cause more pain." I stood there with my laptop in my hands, feeling like I'd already lost. Dominic had gotten to everyone before me. He'd poisoned the well so thoroughly that anything I said would just confirm his story about me being in denial. I drove home in silence, trying to figure out what to do next. That night, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Chadwick, and when I read it, my heart sank even lower than I thought possible. "They're talking about pressing charges," the message said, "against me, for something I didn't do." I called him immediately. He picked up on the first ring, and I could hear how scared he was just from the way he said hello. "Who told you that?" I asked. "Dad called me an hour ago. He said Dominic convinced him that pressing charges is the only way to get the money back. They think if they take me to court, I'll crack and tell them where I hid everything." His voice was shaking. "Harry, I don't have their money. I never touched it. But nobody believes me except you." I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Dominic wasn't just going to let Chadwick take the blame. He was going to send my brother to prison to cover up his own crime. And if I didn't find a way to stop him, it was going to work. Dominic had poisoned everyone against me before I even opened my mouth, turning my own family into witnesses for his defense instead of mine. He knew exactly what I'd find in those records, which meant he knew exactly what he was hiding and had already built his walls before I could knock them down. Vicente was the only one who would listen, and even he was scared to speak up in front of the rest of the family. But I noticed something in those altered timestamps that Dominic had missed. The changes came from the same device that made the original transfers, which meant the digital fingerprints were identical. And I could prove it if I had the right software and 10 minutes alone with his computer. The family business had a board meeting scheduled for Friday morning at 10. Everyone would be in the conference room going over quarterly reports. Everyone except me, since Dominic had already convinced them I shouldn't be involved in sensitive family matters until the situation with Chadwick was resolved. I called Vicente that night and told him what I needed. At first he was quiet on the other end of the line, and I could tell he was weighing the risks against what we might find. "You want me to keep Dominic busy while you break into his office?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "I'm not breaking in," I said. "The office is in a building my family owns. I have every right to be there." Vicente laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Try telling that to Dominic when he catches you going through his computer." I waited while he thought it over. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the phone, and I knew he was scared. We both were, but then he said, "Fine, I'll do it. But you better find something good in there, Harry, because if you don't, we're both going to look like idiots and Chadwick is still going to prison." I told him I understood the stakes, and we made a plan for Friday morning. Vicente would show up to the board meeting a few minutes early and corner Dominic with questions about the budget reports. He said he could keep him talking for at least 15 minutes if he played it right, maybe longer if he pretended to be confused about some of the numbers. That would give me enough time to get in, find what I needed, and get out before anyone noticed I was there. The night before the meeting, I barely slept at all. I kept running through everything that could go wrong, all the ways this could blow up in my face and make things even worse for Chadwick. But I also kept thinking about my brother sitting alone in his apartment, waiting to find out if his own family was going to send him to prison for a crime he didn't commit. That thought was enough to push me forward no matter how scared I was. Friday morning came too fast and not fast enough at the same time. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the family business so nobody would see it in the lot. The building was a small office complex that my father and Dominic had started together almost 25 years ago, back when they were young and still believed they could build something that would last for generations. Now it was just another piece of evidence in my uncle's betrayal. I watched from across the street as people started arriving for the meeting. My father's car pulled in first, then a few of the other board members who weren't family but had been with the company for years. Dominic showed up at 9:45, right on schedule, driving the fancy car he'd bought last year. At the time, I remember thinking he must have gotten a good deal on it somewhere. Now I wondered how much of my parents' retirement fund was sitting in that garage. Vicente texted me at 9:58. "Going in now. He's heading for the conference room. You have 15 minutes, maybe 20 if I can stretch it." I took a deep breath and walked across the street like I belonged there, which technically I did. The back entrance to the building was around the side, past the dumpsters and the employee parking spots. I'd used it 100 times when I worked here during college summers, and the code on the door hadn't changed in over a decade. 4721. The same code my father picked because it was my mother's birthday. The hallway was empty when I slipped inside. I could hear voices coming from the conference room at the other end of the building, muffled by distance and closed doors. Dominic's office was on the second floor, up the back stairs and to the left. I moved quickly but tried not to run because running would look suspicious if anyone happened to see me. The door to his office was closed but not locked. I turned the handle and pushed it open, half expecting an alarm to go off or someone to shout at me from down the hall, but nothing happened. The room was dark and quiet, with morning light coming through the blinds and landing in stripes across Dominic's big wooden desk. I closed the door behind me and went straight for the computer. The screen was dark, but when I moved the mouse, it lit up immediately. No password screen, no security prompt, just Dominic's desktop with all his files and folders sitting right there waiting for someone to look at them. His arrogance had worked in my favor. He never thought anyone would actually check because he'd spent so much time convincing everyone that there was nothing to check. Why bother locking your computer when you've already made sure nobody suspects you of anything? I sat down in his chair and started looking through the files. Most of them were normal business stuff, invoices and contracts and emails about shipments. But there was one folder tucked away in a corner of the screen that didn't match the others. It was labeled with a string of random numbers and letters, the kind of thing that would look like a system file to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. I clicked on it and my breath caught in my throat. The original transfer records were all there, laid out in neat rows with dates and amounts and account numbers. But these weren't the same records I'd seen before. These were the real ones, the ones that hadn't been altered to frame my brother. And they showed exactly where the money had gone. An offshore account, with Dominic's name on it. He'd been siphoning from my parents for months, taking a little bit at a time so nobody would notice until it was too late. The amounts matched what my mother had told me was missing, down to the last penny. Over $200,000 of my parents' retirement, sitting in an account that my uncle controlled. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run downstairs and drag Dominic out of that conference room and make him explain himself in front of everyone. But I knew that wouldn't work. I needed proof that couldn't be denied, evidence that Dominic couldn't explain away with another lie. I pulled a flash drive out of my pocket and plugged it into the computer. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it twice. The files were big and the transfer seemed to take forever, each second stretching out while I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. 70%, 80%, 90%. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to fly open any second. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, moving fast, getting closer. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The progress bar hit 95%. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I yanked the flash drive out of the computer and shoved it in my pocket just as Dominic's voice carried through the door. "Who left my office unlocked?" he said, and he sounded annoyed rather than suspicious. Like this was just another small problem in his perfect day. I heard the doorknob start to turn. I moved faster than I'd ever moved in my life, crossing the room in 3 steps and pushing through the back door that led to the emergency stairs. The door clicked shut behind me just as I heard Dominic walk into his office. I stood on the landing with my back pressed against the wall, trying to control my breathing so he wouldn't hear me through the thin door. My legs felt like they were made of water. The flash drive in my pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. For a long moment, I just stood there listening to Dominic moving around in his office, opening drawers and shuffling papers. Then I heard him mutter something I couldn't make out, and his footsteps moved away from the back door toward the front of the room. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I went down those stairs as fast as I could without making noise, and I didn't stop moving until I was back in my car 2 blocks away. My hands were still shaking when I pulled out of the parking spot and started driving home. I had everything I needed to save my brother and destroy my uncle. The question was how to use it without giving Dominic another chance to spin the story in his favor. I sat in my car with proof that would save my brother and destroy my uncle, but Dominic had spent weeks making me look unstable. If I just showed up with a flash drive, he'd claim I planted everything. I needed witnesses who couldn't be dismissed. I pulled out my phone and called Vicente. "I have it all," I said when he picked up, "but I need this to happen somewhere Dominic can't control." Vicente was quiet for a moment, then said, "Where?" I thought about it and realized the answer was obvious. My parents' anniversary dinner was Saturday. The whole family would be there. Dominic would be there, confident and untouchable. He had no idea I was about to return the favor for every lie he told about my brother. Saturday came faster than I expected, and I spent most of the day going over my plan again and again until I had every detail memorized. The flash drive sat in my pocket like a small weight that kept reminding me what was at stake. I got to my parents' house about an hour before the dinner was supposed to start, and I was surprised by how nice everything looked. My mother had set up the dining room with the good tablecloth, the one she only brought out for special occasions, and there were flowers in the center of the table that must have cost more than she usually spent on things like that. Candles were lit everywhere, giving the whole room this warm glow that made it feel like nothing bad had ever happened in this family. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was really there. The anniversary dinner started beautifully, with my father helping my mother into her chair like they were on a first date instead of celebrating decades of marriage. My parents looked happy for the first time in weeks, and watching them smile at each other made my chest feel tight because I knew what I was about to do might ruin this night forever. But then I thought about Chadwick, and the tightness turned into something harder. The other guests started arriving one by one, aunts and uncles and cousins filing through the front door with cards and small gifts wrapped in shiny paper. Everyone hugged my parents and said the things you say at anniversary parties, stuff like "you two are an inspiration" and "here's to many more years together." I stood near the back of the room watching everyone come in, and I noticed the moment Dominic walked through the door. He was wearing a nice suit, nicer than anyone else, and he carried a bottle of expensive wine that he presented to my mother with this big smile on his face. "For the happy couple," he said, and my mother actually teared up a little as she thanked him. I wanted to throw up. Vicente caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod. He knew what was coming. He was the only one who did. I nodded back and tried to keep my face calm, even though my heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. The dinner itself was catered, which surprised me because my mother usually liked to cook everything herself for family events. But I guess after everything that happened with the money, she didn't have the energy for that anymore. The food was good though, some kind of chicken with vegetables and potatoes, and everyone sat around the big table talking and laughing like this was just another family gathering. I kept looking at the empty chair at the end of the table, the one where Chadwick should have been sitting. Before dinner started, I'd asked my mother why he wasn't there. She got this uncomfortable look on her face and said, "He was asked not to come. It's too uncomfortable right now. Until this is resolved, I just think it's better if he stays away." The way she said it, like Chadwick was some kind of problem that needed to be dealt with instead of her own son, made me so angry I had to walk away before I said something I couldn't take back. So there we were, this big, happy family celebration, and nobody would even talk about the fact that my brother was sitting alone somewhere wondering if he was going to prison for something he didn't do. Dominic sat at the head of the table like he belonged there, telling stories and making everyone laugh, while my parents beamed at him like he was the best thing that ever happened to their family. About halfway through the meal, Dominic stood up and tapped his wine glass with his fork to get everyone's attention. The room got quiet and all eyes turned to him. He held up his glass and cleared his throat. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, and his voice was smooth and confident like always. "To family, to trust, to standing together when times get hard." He paused and looked directly at me as he said that last part, and there was something in his eyes that felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to say something in front of everyone. "This family has been through a lot lately," Dominic continued, still looking at me. "But we're strong. We stick together, and we don't let anything tear us apart." Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and my mother reached over to squeeze Dominic's hand like he had just said the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. I took a small sip of my wine and set the glass down. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping sound it made against the floor seemed way too loud in the quiet room. "I have something to share," I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. "About the missing money." The mood in the room changed instantly. I could feel it like a cold wind blowing through an open window. My mother's face fell and my father looked down at his plate. Some of my cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances like they wished they could be anywhere else. But Dominic's smile didn't waver. If anything, it got wider. He set his wine glass down and looked at me with this expression that was part pity and part disappointment, like I was a little kid who wouldn't stop bringing up a dead pet at Christmas dinner. Harry, he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made me want to scream. We've been over this. Let's not ruin your parents' evening with more conspiracy theories. A few people around the table nodded, and I heard someone whisper something I couldn't quite make out. My mother reached across the table toward me. Please, Harry, she said quietly. Not tonight. This is supposed to be a happy occasion. I looked at her face, at the pleading in her eyes, and for 1 second I almost sat back down. Every face at that table was looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the one hurting the family by refusing to accept the obvious truth. The room felt smaller than it had a minute ago, and I could feel the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on me. Dominic was still smiling, still so confident that he had won this before it even started. He thought he knew exactly how this would go. He thought I would back down like I always did, that I would mumble an apology and sit back in my chair and let him keep running his story. But then I thought about Chadwick, alone at his apartment right now, probably staring at his phone waiting for news about whether his own family was going to destroy his life. I thought about the flash drive in my pocket with all the proof I needed. I thought about how Dominic had looked my father in the eye and lied about everything, and how he was going to keep lying until someone stopped him. I didn't sit down. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive, holding it up so everyone could see. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could even though my heart was pounding. I'm asking you to look at the evidence that Dominic didn't want you to see. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Dominic's smile finally cracked, just a little bit around the edges, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something like fear in his eyes. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and set it on the table in front of me, my hands surprisingly steady now that the moment was finally here. The flash drive clicked into the USB port, and I opened the files, turning the screen so everyone could see. Bank records filled the display, row after row of transfers with dates and amounts and account numbers that told the whole story. These are the original records from Dominic's computer, I said, the ones that show where the money really went. My mother leaned forward to look at the screen, and I watched her eyes move across the numbers. The bank records filled the screen, showing everything I had found in that office. The offshore account with its long string of numbers, the altered timestamps that had been changed to frame my brother, and right there at the bottom of each transfer, clear as day, was Dominic's digital signature on every single one. I scrolled slowly so everyone could see, pointing at each piece of evidence as it appeared. This is the account where all the money went, I said. Over $200,000 transferred in small amounts over 3 months. And this signature right here, this digital code, it can only come from one person, the person who set up the account in the first place. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me. My aunts and uncles were staring at the screen with their mouths open. My father had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he might fall over if he let go. And Dominic, for the first time since I'd known him, looked like a man who had just realized he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. But he recovered fast, faster than I expected. He slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to make the dishes rattle, and when he spoke, his voice came out way too loud for the small room. Those are fabricated, he said, and there was this edge to his words that I'd never heard before. Harry's been trying to frame me since the beginning. I told all of you this would happen. I warned you he would make up evidence to protect his brother, and here he is doing exactly what I said he would do. He looked around the table at all the faces watching him, trying to find someone who would nod along like they always did. But nobody was nodding this time. Nobody was agreeing with him or shaking their heads at me. They were all just staring at the screen with these looks on their faces like they didn't know what to believe anymore. My mother was still leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the numbers. I watched her face change as she looked at the account information, really looked at it for the first time without Dominic's voice in her ear telling her what to think. Her forehead wrinkled and she brought her hand up to her mouth like she was trying to hold something back. Then she turned to look at Dominic, and her voice was small and confused when she spoke. That's your account number, Dominic, she said, and the words hung in the air like something heavy that nobody wanted to catch. I recognize it from when you helped us set up the business. You wrote it down for me on that little notepad I keep in the kitchen. I still have it somewhere. Dominic's face went through about 5 different emotions in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, then anger, then fear, then something that looked almost like panic before he got control of himself again. He turned away from my mother and looked at my father instead, and I could see him switching tactics, trying to figure out a new way to spin this. You're really going to believe this? He said to my father, and now his voice had this hurt sound to it like he was the one being wronged. After everything I've done for this family? After 20 years of building this business together, of being there for every birthday and every holiday, of helping out whenever anyone needed anything, you're going to throw all that away because Harry copied some files onto a flash drive? My father didn't answer right away. He just sat there looking at the screen, then at Dominic, then back at the screen again. His face was hard to read, like he was having a whole conversation with himself inside his head that none of us could hear. I could see how much this was hurting him, finding out that his own brother might have done something this terrible. But I could also see something else starting to grow behind his eyes, something that looked a lot like the anger I'd been feeling for weeks. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, and I was starting to worry that Dominic's words had worked, that my father was going to choose family loyalty over the truth sitting right in front of him. But then Vicente pushed his chair back and stood up from the table, and everyone turned to look at him. My cousin wasn't a loud person. He usually sat in the background at family events, listening more than talking, staying out of arguments whenever he could. So when he stood up and cleared his throat, people paid attention in a way they might not have for someone else. His hands were shaking a little, and I could tell how hard this was for him, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I was with Harry when he found these files," Vicente said, looking straight at Dominic with more courage than I'd ever seen from him. "On your computer, in your office, at the family business, during the board meeting on Friday." A murmur went through the room as people started connecting the dots. Dominic's eyes went wide and he took a small step back from the table like Vicente's words had physically pushed him. My cousin kept going, his voice getting stronger with each sentence. "I kept you busy in the conference room while Harry went upstairs. He didn't plan anything. He didn't fabricate anything. He just copied the files that were already there. The ones you thought nobody would ever look for because you'd convinced everyone that Chadwick was guilty." The room exploded into noise. Everyone started talking at once, asking questions and demanding answers, and looking back and forth between Dominic and the laptop screen. My aunt was saying something about how she always thought Dominic spent too much money on things he couldn't afford. My uncle on my father's side kept repeating, "I can't believe this," over and over like a broken record. And through it all, Dominic just stood there with his mouth opening and closing, trying to find words that would fix this but coming up empty. I watched him start to crumble, and I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and sadness. Part of me had hoped I was wrong about all of it, that there was some explanation that would make sense without destroying our family. But there wasn't. The evidence was right there on the screen, and Vicente had just confirmed exactly how I got it. Dominic was caught, and everyone in the room knew it. My mother turned to face him fully, and her expression had changed from confusion to something much colder. "You came to our house the day after we found out," she said slowly, like she was putting together a puzzle in her head and not liking the picture that was forming. "You sat in our living room and you pointed at Chadwick. You told us he must have done it because he needed money. You made us believe our own son was a thief." Her voice cracked on the last word, and my father reached over to take her hand. "All this time," she continued, "while we were talking about pressing charges against our own child, you knew. You knew exactly where that money was because you were the one who took it." Dominic held up his hands like he was trying to stop traffic. "Aitana, listen to me," he started, but my mother wasn't finished. "Don't you dare say my name like we're still family," she said, and her voice had gotten louder than I'd ever heard it. "You were going to let my son go to prison for something you did. What kind of person does that?" I stood there watching this unfold, feeling like I was in a dream where everything was finally going the way it should have gone from the beginning. All those days of being told I was crazy, of being shut down every time I tried to explain what I'd found, of watching my brother get pushed out of the family for a crime he didn't commit. All of it was worth it for this moment, for seeing the truth finally come out in front of everyone who had doubted me. My father stood up from his chair, and the room got quiet again. He was a big man, my father, and when he moved, people tended to pay attention. He walked around the table until he was standing right in front of Dominic, close enough that they could have touched if either one of them reached out. The two brothers faced each other, and I could see 20 years of history passing between them. All the business meetings and family dinners, all the holidays and birthday parties, all the trust that my father had placed in this man who turned out to be nothing like he pretended to be. Dominic's face had gone from angry to desperate, and I could see him trying to figure out what to say, what magic words might make this all go away. But there were no magic words. There was just the truth, sitting on my laptop screen for everyone to see. My father's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but it carried through the silent room like thunder. "I want to hear you say it," he said. "I want to hear you admit what you did." The room split in half right in front of me. Some people were looking at Dominic with horror on their faces, like they were seeing him for the first time and didn't like what they saw. Others looked at me like I'd just set off a bomb at a birthday party, like I was the one who had ruined everything by bringing this up on such a special night. Dominic grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and headed for the door, moving fast like he couldn't stand to be in that room for another second. "I don't have to listen to this," he said over his shoulder, his voice trying to sound confident, but coming out shaky instead. "When you all come to your senses, you know where to find me." But before he could reach the front door, My father moved to block his path. The two brothers stood face to face for the first time without all the pretending, without the masks they'd been wearing for each other all these years. 20 years of family dinners and business partnerships and holiday cards hung in the air between them, all of it balanced on whatever happened in the next 30 seconds. My father spoke first, and his voice was low and hard in a way I'd never heard from him before. "You told me my own son was a thief," he said, and each word landed like a punch. "You looked me in the eye and lied." The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Everyone was watching, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. Dominic stood there facing my father, and for a moment it looked like he might try to keep up the act, might try one more time to spin some story that would make all of this go away. But then something changed in his face. The smooth confidence that he'd worn like a second skin for as long as I could remember just melted away. And what was left underneath was something ugly and raw and honest, for maybe the first time ever. His shoulders dropped and his jaw got tight, and when he spoke again, his voice wasn't smooth anymore. It was bitter and angry, and full of something that sounded almost like hate. "I built that business," Dominic said, and he jabbed his finger toward my father's chest. "I made this family what it is. 20 years I spent turning that little company into something real, something that actually made money, something that put food on all of your tables. And you think I was going to let it all go to waste on your retirement?" The words hung in the air like poison, and I watched my father's face change as he realized what his brother was really saying. This wasn't just about stolen money anymore. This was about resentment that had been building for decades, about Dominic feeling like he deserved more than he got, about all the times he smiled at family dinners while hating everyone around him. My mother stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the table, and her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She looked smaller than usual somehow, like the weight of what was happening had pushed her down a few inches. But her voice was clear when she spoke, even though it was barely above a whisper. "You stole from us," she said, and there was no anger in her tone, just this deep, sad thing that was almost worse. "And you were going to let Chadwick go to prison for it." She said my brother's name like it hurt her mouth to form the word, and I thought about all the times over the past few weeks when she'd refused to look at Chadwick, when she'd believed the worst about her own son because Dominic told her to. All that pain, all that broken trust between a mother and her child, and it was all because of the man standing in front of us right now. Dominic turned to face my mother, and there was no apology in his expression. No guilt, no shame. Just this cold calculation, like he was still trying to figure out how to talk his way out of this, even though everyone in the room had seen the proof. "Chadwick's weak," he said, and the words came out flat and matter-of-fact, like he was explaining something obvious to a child who couldn't understand basic math. "He would have survived prison. He's young. He would have gotten out eventually and moved on with his life. But if people found out about the account, if they saw where the money really went, the business would collapse. Everyone would lose everything." He looked around the room at all the faces staring back at him, and for a second I thought I saw something like genuine belief in his eyes, like he actually thought what he was saying made sense, like he honestly believed that sending my brother to prison was the reasonable choice, the smart choice, the one that protected the family better than telling the truth ever could. "I was trying to save us," Dominic continued, and his voice got louder like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "All of us, the business, the jobs, everything we built together. If that money came to light, if people saw the hole in the accounts, investors would have run, clients would have left. The whole thing would have fallen apart, and everyone in this room would have lost their income, their security, everything they depend on. I made a hard choice. I did what had to be done." The silence that followed was heavy and thick, and I could see people around the room trying to process what they were hearing. My uncle was basically admitting to everything, but he was doing it in a way that made him sound like the hero of his own story. Like stealing $200,000 from his own brother and framing his nephew for the crime was just smart business sense. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped forward until I was standing right next to my father, facing Dominic head on. My hands were shaking a little, but my voice came out steady, and I made sure to look him straight in the face when I spoke. "You didn't do this to protect the family," I said. "You did it because you were scared of getting caught." Dominic's mouth opened like he was going to argue, but I kept going before he could get a word out. "You've been skimming from the business for years, haven't you? The fancy car, the expensive suits, all those vacations you took that nobody else could afford. That money had to come from somewhere. And when the amounts got big enough that someone might notice, you panicked. You needed a way to cover your tracks. And Chadwick was the easiest target because you'd already spent years making everyone think he was irresponsible." I could see the truth of it landing on faces around the room. My aunt's eyes went wide, and she looked over at the laptop screen still showing all those bank records. My cousin, who lived 2 towns over, put her hand over her mouth like she was going to be sick. Even Vicente, who had known most of this already, looked shocked at hearing it all laid out so clearly. Dominic's face had gone red, and I could see a vein pulsing in his forehead. He looked around the room at all those faces that had trusted him for so long, that had nodded along with every lie he told, that had turned against Chadwick on his word alone. And now those same faces were looking at him like they didn't even know who he was. "You don't understand," he said, but his voice had lost all its power. He sounded desperate now, small and scared in a way I'd never seen from him before. "None of you understand what it takes to keep something like this running. The pressure, the responsibility, everyone depending on you to make the right calls. I gave everything to this family. Everything. And this is how you repay me?" My father hadn't moved since Dominic started talking. He just stood there like a wall, blocking the path to the door, his arms crossed over his chest and his face like stone. I'd seen my father angry before, but this was different. This was something deeper than anger. This was the look of a man who had just watched everything he believed about his own brother turn to ash right in front of him. "You gave everything," my father repeated slowly, and his voice was so cold it made me shiver even though I wasn't the one he was talking to. "You took our retirement. You tried to destroy our son. You lied to our faces for months while we cried ourselves to sleep wondering how we were going to survive. And you call that giving?" Dominic took a step back, bumping into the edge of the dining table. Some of the dishes rattled and a wine glass tipped over, spilling red across my mother's nice white tablecloth like blood spreading across snow. He looked around the room one more time, searching for someone, anyone, who might still be on his side. But there was no one. Every face in that room had closed against him. Even the relatives who had been nodding along with him just an hour ago were looking away now, unable to meet his eyes, embarrassed that they had ever believed his lies in the first place. "This isn't fair," Dominic said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I'm your brother. We built that company together. You can't just throw away everything we have over some money." My mother made a sound that was almost like a laugh but had no humor in it at all. "Some money," she repeated. "Our entire future, our retirement, 30 years of saving every penny we could so we wouldn't have to worry when we got old. You call that some money?" She shook her head slowly, and when she looked at Dominic again, there was nothing left in her eyes but exhaustion and disgust. "I trusted you. I defended you to Harry when he tried to tell me the truth. I chose to believe you over my own son, over my own instincts, because I thought I knew who you were. I thought you were family." The word family seemed to hit Dominic harder than anything else that had been said. He flinched like someone had slapped him, and for just a second I saw something that might have been real emotion flash across his face, regret maybe, or shame, or just the pain of finally being seen for what he really was after so many years of hiding behind a mask. But then it was gone, replaced by that same hard, angry look he'd been wearing since his excuses stopped working. He straightened his jacket and lifted his chin, trying to hold on to whatever was left of his dignity, even though everyone in the room could see right through him now. "Fine," he said, and his voice had gone flat and cold. "If that's how you want it. But don't come crying to me when the business falls apart and none of you know what to do. Don't call me when you realize you need my help to keep things running. I'm done saving people who don't appreciate what I've done for them." He turned toward the door like he was going to walk out on his own terms, like this was his choice instead of his punishment. But my father was still standing in the way, and he didn't move an inch. Instead, he reached over and opened the front door, letting in a rush of cool evening air that made the candles on the dining table flicker and dance. Then my father pointed to the street outside, and his voice was steady and final when he spoke. "Get out," he said, "and don't come back." Dominic stood there for a long moment, staring at his brother like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Like even after everything that had been said, some part of him expected my father to change his mind at the last second and tell him it was all okay, that they could work this out, that family was more important than money or truth or any of the other things that had just been thrown in his face. But my father didn't move. He just kept pointing at that open door, at the darkness waiting outside, at the end of everything Dominic had thought he could count on. And finally, after what felt like forever, Dominic walked through it. His footsteps echoed on the porch, then faded as he made his way down the driveway toward his fancy car that was probably bought with money he stole from us. Nobody said anything until we heard the engine start and the headlights sweep across the front windows as he backed out and drove away. Then my mother sat down heavily in the nearest chair and put her face in her hands, and my father closed the door and leaned against it like he needed something solid to hold him up. The anniversary dinner was ruined. The nice tablecloth was stained with wine, and the candles were burning down to nothing, and half the food on the table had gone cold while we were all too busy dealing with the truth to eat. But as I looked around at my family, at all the people who had finally seen what I'd been trying to show them for weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe normally. Vicente came over and put his hand on my shoulder, and my mother looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Call your brother," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell him to come home."